Moving on to the next surah, Surah Al-Tahrim, after Surah Al-Talaq. This is marriage, divorce. Surah Al-Tahrim also has to do with marriage. What's very beautiful and interesting about this is that because people generally think that they can paint a perfect image of what a marriage is, Allah Azza wa Jal starts the guidance regarding a marriage with the Prophet ﷺ, that you'd assume that there could not be a more perfect marriage between the Prophet ﷺ and his wives. And indeed, in the capacity of being human beings, it was and is. But at the end of the day, they're human beings. Because marriage is something so sanctified, so sacred, so private, Allah Azza wa Jal, out of hikmah, makes the Prophet ﷺ a public prototype, public example. That is an example for marriage. And this is something very, very important. As many of the points of guidance we learned in the surah before, right? We learn things from the Quran and Sunnah, from Deen. Deen inspires everything we do. Our Deen inspires everything we do. The Deen is not only in the masjid or only when you read Quran. Deen is in every part of your life, including your relationships, your marriages, your different bonds with people. So in this surah, the surah starts uniquely with discussing again things related to marriage, and specifically examples from Rasulullah ﷺ and his family. But then later on goes into jihad, as well as stories of prophets before. What is the relationship between this and jihad? That in both scenarios, in marriage or in jihad, you have to at times make sacrifices. If you want to be rewarded, you have to make compromises. You have to make sacrifices. It is a continuous struggle, which is why later on jihad comes in as well. Rasulullah ﷺ is considered a spiritual father for the entire ummah, which is why his example is being given here. The spiritual father is at times very kind, but at times, to restore balance, justice, and sharia, has to be a bit more firm. And so there are some ayat in here which are quite firm and assertive in their tone. A very important principle to understand before we discuss these ayat, that these ayat do not belittle the Ummahatul Mu'mineen, the mothers of the believers, meaning the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. These ayat, which point to a situation which had occurred, right, are not so that we learn, what were the mistakes of the Sahaba. That's not the point of these ayat. Rather, if you read them properly, you'll understand that these ayat are a means of honoring them. And I'll repeat this later. But a means of honoring them. Why? Because after a mistake was made, true tawbah was made. And the laws of Allah Azza wa Jal were followed, making the Ummahatul Mu'mineen and their relationship with Rasulullah ﷺ a perfect example of what a marriage is supposed to be. Allah Azza wa Jal starts by saying, Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu lima tuharrimu ma ahallallahu lak tabtaghi mardata azwajik wallahu ghafurur rahim. O Prophet, why do you prohibit yourself what Allah has made lawful for you in order to attain the good pleasure of your wives? That again, if you don't have this is probably a great example. This surah and many other surahs in places as well, but this surah here is a good example of if you don't have certain background in ilm and Islamic knowledge specifically, you will misinterpret it. You will misinterpret it. This is why background knowledge is extremely important. And a lot of people just think that you can just access Quran is kitabun mubin, a clear book. So why can't everyone just read it? Yeah, it is a clear book in many places, and in many places it's not. In many places it requires a lot more background knowledge. And so if you try to interpret these ayats again just by face value, you'll start to have thoughts which are inappropriate. You won't raise the rank of, you know, the Sahaba and ultimately billah, the Prophet ﷺ. And have there been people under the name of Islam who have said ill things about the Ummahatul Mu'mineen? I don't need to get into it, but yeah. Which is why it's very important. You must have background knowledge. You must have ilm. And if you don't have the ability to do that, then just rely on what the ulama say. Otherwise, you will take your own self to misunderstanding. So there's a story narrated regarding these ayat, and there's various narrations. And some of the narrations are very even, some of them are kind of strange. All right. Remember, narrating and narrations and hadith is an entire science of itself. How to know it, how to access it. Just because something is a hadith doesn't mean it's applied. Just because something is a hadith doesn't mean it's accurate or by its face value. There's a context to it generally. There's a way it has to be understood. Right? So there's a narration which some of the ulama at least support to some degree, which is that Rasulullah ﷺ once came back home and noticed that his wives had differed over an issue, and there were some on one side and some on the other. Right? So they became like two teams, two parties. And Rasulullah ﷺ had came home, and when he came home, one of his wives had mentioned that there is a smell of some sort, and this smell was of honey that Rasulullah ﷺ had ate before coming home. It is known as maghafir, and that was honey, and they put some stuff together or whatever it was. And so when she said this, Rasulullah ﷺ said, as he himself was very sensitive to scents, to smells, he said that I would make this haram, or I would not apply this anymore, I would not eat it anymore. And one wife tells another, and the later ayat point to this. One wife tells another, and there's two parties, and a conflict more or less takes place, right? Which again, the details of it are not important, right? What's important is what was the solution or what happened after, right? And this is a good example of something which we generally get stuck in our marriages, not only our marriages, but in relationship with people. That it's not always about being right. It's not always about establishing your point. It's not always about having the last say. Right? Rasulullah ﷺ said that I guarantee a house in Jannah for a person who leaves an argument even if he's right. Right? We sometimes act like custodians of the truth, just like we have to establish the truth, because if we're not going to establish justice, then who else is? And doing that, we end up arguing with people, fighting with people. And just like that in a marriage, that between a husband and a wife, when things become competitive, and the last surah spoke about this as well, Surah Al-Taghabun as well, that when this competition is like, there's like, one has to establish, if that's what you think the purpose of your marriage is, to establish a dominance, to establish, you know, over here, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is actually, what is he doing? He's compromising. He's saying, I won't eat the honey. I won't do whatever it is that you're disliking. That's the first thing Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam does. But then Allah Azza wa Jal reminds Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that you are not to make anything halal or haram without my order. So لِمَ تُحَرِّمُ مَا أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ لَكَ, right? Even if it's in good intention, why now the Sharia is involved? Why are you prohibiting something that Allah Azza wa Jal has made lawful for you? There's another great lesson in here for us, which is, when we go around talking about this is halal, that is haram, that is haram, this is halal, you have to be very careful. And you have to be very cautious of what you're saying. Allah Azza wa Jal is reminding the Nabi that you cannot say without my order. Right? So we must be very cautious and when we speak about these things and when we talk about these things. You could be very much possibly without evidence, without support, without ilm, say something is halal when Allah has made it haram, or say something is haram when Allah has made it halal. That's a great sin. It's a very kabira, very, we think, when we think about kaba'ir, great sins, we think about, all these different things like backbiting, zina, etc. Well, guess what? This is also a very great sin. This is from the kaba'ir. This is from the kaba'ir. So you have to have ilm to do this. Even Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is guided that if Allah Azza wa Jal has not made something haram, then you shall not make it haram. You shall not make it, for whatever reason that may be. Wallahu ghafur rahim, and Allah Azza wa Jalla is surely most forgiving and all merciful. قد فرض الله لكم تحلة إيمانكم والله مولاكم وهو العليم الحكيم. And again, these ayat, we'll read through them, but they simply have to do all with the same situation, that Allah has already sanctioned for the believers to absolve yourselves from your oaths. Allah alone is your patron, and He is all-knowing and all-wise. وَإِذْ أَسَرَّ النَّبِيُّ إِلَى بَعْضِ أَزْوَاجِهِ حَدِيثًا. Behold, when the Prophet ﷺ confided a matter to one of his wives, then when she told another of his wives of it, that Allah acquainted him with it, the Prophet made known part of it and avoided disclosing a part. Then when we disclosed to her what she had divulged, she said, who told you this? He said, the one who is all knowledgeable, all aware. Again, this is going back to that same situation. The point being, that these Sahaba were still human beings, and even Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, we don't say that he was not a human being. He was still a human. Although we believe that he was the, saying he's a human, generally when we say this, I'm a human, we say this in the context of I can make mistakes, right? If you make a mistake, what do you say? I'm a human. I make a mistake. When we say Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is a human, we're not saying that to say that he can make mistakes. We're saying that as a praise for him. Right? Because the fact that he had the same human qualities just like you and I, he was much better than us. Right? That's the point to understand. When we say Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was a human, we're not saying this to bring him down. We're saying this to raise him up. Right? That despite the qualities that you and I know of, you and I fight of being a human, our desires, so many other things. Despite those very strong qualities, look at the type of person Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was. Right? And likewise can be said about the Ummahatul Mu'mineen and the Sahaba. Right? That and you could praise them in a much similar and strong way, which is that they themselves were also human beings. Right? And they did not see Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam like the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. They were not given prophethood or anything like that. But despite that, despite all of that, who they were, when they were, where they were, right? greater than any other human being to other human beings to step on the face of this earth. So this is very extremely important to happen to understand. But at the same time, that they are human beings, and that the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, at different times showed these human qualities. And how did Rasulullah ﷺ go about handling it? The beauty in the message that is being given in these ayat regarding marriage is not about how a particular situation is supposed to be or how a particular marriage is supposed to be, but it's about the process of how it is. So in a marriage, when people have conflict, you'd think that the conflict is, when the best solution to the conflict is that, perhaps the man gets his way, end of story, family moves on. But this was not the process here, nor is it the process ever of what a marriage is supposed to be. Rather, the process is supposed to be discussion, dialogue, understanding, compromise on both sides. And this is what you learn from these ayat, that it's about the process, not necessarily the end goal of everything. Later on, Allah Azza wa Jal will say that if Allah wishes, then Rasulullah ﷺ can divorce his wives, can divorce you. But Rasulullah ﷺ divorce, isn't divorce something bad? The idea being that, it's number one, these things are not necessarily about bad or good a lot of times. They're part of just being human, And number two, that again, if something were like that to happen, it would be an order from Allah Azza wa Jal. It would be an order from Allah Azza wa Jal. That even that is possible. Even that can be an order from Allah Azza wa Jal. This is all so that we fix our image of how these things are supposed to be. Because we have understandings of how these things are supposed to be based on what knowledge? When a person gets married today, they don't go through a marriage course. When a person gets married today, they don't have a degree in marriage that they get from their Jamaat, from their college. But we go on obtaining these great responsibilities, which are greater than our own jobs. You get later on, the surah will say, "Qu anfusakum," protect you and your family from the fire, which is the ultimate goal of a marriage. Right? Not to build a house, not to have a family necessarily, not to have grandkids. The ultimate goal of a marriage, even if those things happen, is for you to protect yourself from the fire. If you're doing that, you're attaining what the marriage is for. If you're not doing that, then you can have the most picture-perfect marriage, doesn't matter. The most picture-perfect family, doesn't matter. Allah Azza wa Jal wants you to use your family to protect yourself from the fire. That's what the point of it is. إن تتوبا إلى الله فقد صغت قلوبكما وإن تظاهرا عليه فإن الله ومولاه وجبريل وصالح المؤمنين. Allah Azza wa Jal has said that if these two parties, turn in repentance to Allah Azza wa Jal, it will be accepted, for your hearts have truly inclined. But if you support one another against him, then Allah Azza wa Jal, Allah Azza wa Jal is saying now basically that, and this is something also very important to kind of learn from, that now this is a marriage between Rasulullah ﷺ and his wives. Who is to come in the middle to mediate? Allah Azza wa Jal himself. Meaning, it's sometimes very good, and this is something we don't have a lot nowadays, but it's very important that in a marriage there should be someone or some person or some people who are able to mediate. We know that these rules come in Surah An-Nisa as well, in the 5th juz, regarding this, that there should be people who can mediate, who can be arbiters in a marriage between two other people from outside the marriage. Right? outside of the marriage of Rasulullah ﷺ and his wives, who is mediating, who is controlling, who is guiding? Allah Azza wa Jal himself. The reason for that, so that this can be an example for you and I, that how should these things happen? So after counsel takes place, counsel coming from Allah Azza wa Jal, guidance coming from Allah Azza wa Jal, and Allah reminds, right, وَإِن تَظَاهَرَ عَلَيْهِ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ مَوْلَاهُ وَجِبْرِيلُ وَصَالِحُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمَلَائِكَةُ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ ظَهِيرٌ. That talking in a tone which is very firm to the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, that if you want to continue the conflict and you don't want to resolve just because of a stubbornness, right? Sometimes a husband and a wife, one may be stubborn. A person will be stubborn, and not just in a husband and a wife, but in any relationship you can apply this. That if a person wants to be stubborn, it's going to go nowhere. So if you want to be stubborn, Allah Azza wa Jal is saying, just remember that Allah Azza wa Jal is there for the Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and Jibreel is there for Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and the believers are there for Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, meaning you will be left abandoned. Right? You will be left with no one. وَالْمَلَائِكَةُ بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ ظَهِيرٌ. And then the angels after that as well, right, will be with Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam as supporters. There's something important that we can understand from this as well, which is that in any relationship in life, you can have the relationship or you don't have to have the relationship. What am I saying by this? Whether it's a marriage or whether it's a general relationship, if you choose to have good terms with that person or your husband or your wife or that friend, it will have to take an active choice and effort to maintain that relationship. If you want to separate, you can go your own way, the other person can go their own way. Both of you will live until Allah has written for you to die. When you die, you'll go to the hereafter. No one needs anyone in this life. This is the point being of these ayat. Right? So sometimes people want to exert dominance on other people, that they need me, so I'm going to exert dominance on them. They need me, so I'm going to get my way. Right? Or sometimes some people are just so stubborn. Well, if you want to be stubborn, there's no need to maintain the relationship. You can go your way, I can go my way. And then what will happen? You can apply this to jobs as well. Sometimes people panic when they get fired or if they lose their job. If you lose your job, Allah Azza wa Jalla will grant you another one. As long as you're living, you're gonna get rizq. This is a hadith, as long as you're living, every person will be mustawfi, will completely collect their rizq. And the moment that there's nothing no longer written for you, that's the moment you're gonna die. There's no there's no way to go around this. This is the world's equation. This is the dunya's equation. Allah has written rizq for you, you're alive. Allah says your rizq is done, you die. In this life, right, when it comes to relationships, no one is dependent upon anyone. Right? If you want to maintain the relationships, that's what you're advised to do. That's what you should do. Right? Not because another person needs you or because you need them, but for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? Although in the dynamics and between human beings, generally there's always some sort of dynamics of interdependence. Some people need other people, some people rely on other people. Right? You can use that interdependence as a good thing, or you can use it as an evil thing. You can use the dependence of your wife upon you, that, oh well, my wife needs me, she doesn't have any other financial way, so guess what, I'm gonna get whatever I need. You can use it that way. Or you can use it another way, which is, my wife needs me, I also need her. And so, because of our needs with each other, let's work together for the sake of what? Making Allah Azza wa Jal happy. Two entirely different ways of framing things. And this is, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam spoke about these things. Right? He spoke about these things. When people abuse their employees. Why? Because the employee needs them. Employee needs a paycheck. Employee is doing labor, right? Rasulullah said, whenever you're at the higher rank within that dynamic of society that people depend on you, don't abuse it, don't misuse it. Right? And in reality, if everyone were to really understand their role, nobody needs anyone. You can move on with your life. You'll live to the day you die. But was that the right thing to do? Because now you have this other opposite reaction, which is that truly people do recognize that they don't need other people. Right? Truly people do recognize that they don't need other people, so they just separate from them. Friends don't need friends, and we live in an individualistic society. Right? This is a known factor, that the West is very individualistic. The West may not necessarily advise to reconciliation. Right? It's very strange how that works, but in this, if people recognize that there is a little bit of dependence, number one, between each and every person, number one. But number two, that maintaining and having good relationships for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jalla is a good thing. Not because you need it or not. Right? Do it because it's a good thing, because it's a virtuous thing. Because it makes Allah Azza wa Jalla happy. Not because of a need or a necessity. Right? And so this can be applied in many different contexts. This is something very, very important and to pay attention to know. Right? Everyone has their own way, and on the day of resurrection, everyone will be asked to their own accord. No one is going to be responsible for another person. Not even a husband will be responsible for their wife. Not even a wife would be responsible for their husband. But yeah, they will be responsible for what they did to each other. Right? What did you do? This is why there's a hadith, and although there's some kalam fihi, there's some discussion on it, but there's a hadith regarding the relationship dynamic between a husband and a wife, that Rasulullah said, "La yaghlibuhunna illa la'im." That a man who, no man tries to always overwhelm his wife, over dominant his wife, overpower his wife, except that person is a stingy, belittled person. Meaning that person must have some bad qualities, which is why they're trying to exert this dominance. Respect is not demanded for, respect is gained. Rasulullah ﷺ, in his relationship with his wives, never said, "I'm your husband." But he gained it through the way he acted. He never said, "I'm a man," but he showed it through patience. That strength is not shown through throwing things, breaking things, and yelling, but strength is shown through patience. Rasulullah ﷺ said, "Who is the strong man? A person who can withhold his anger when they get angry." Right? So these are important things to think of. So in these ayat now, these ayat which are speaking to the wives of Rasulullah ﷺ, it's not even Rasulullah ﷺ himself saying it, right? Rasulullah ﷺ himself did not go to his wives and yell at them and say, "This is right and that's wrong and you're wrong." This is Allah Azza wa Jal coming into the middle and saying what's right. This is Allah Azza wa Jal mediating what should be done. So the next ayah says, "Asa rabbuhu," that it may be that his Lord may order that should he divorce, meaning Rasulullah ﷺ, should he divorce his wives, أن يبدله أزواجا خيرا منكن, that Allah Azza wa Jal shall give him instead of you wives who are better than you, submitting themselves willingly to Allah Azza wa Jal, believing women, مسلمات مؤمنات قانتات تائبات عائبات سائحات ثيبات وأبكارا. Allah Azza wa Jal mentions now these praiseworthy qualities of the women, right? That if Allah Azza wa Jal wished, then Rasulullah ﷺ could divorce his wives and grant him wives better than the wives he had before. Now the fact that this didn't happen, Allah Azza wa Jal did not separate Rasulullah ﷺ from his wives, and the 7 wives that he had at the time when this ayah was revealed, remained, this is a sign that they are the best women. You understand now why I said that these ayat are not to lower the Ummahatul Mu'mineen, but to raise their rank. That Allah Azza wa Jal did not change their place. Allah Azza wa Jal did not separate the Prophet ﷺ from these wives. What does that mean? That they are the best women on the earth. That there is no one better that could come in their place. This is why if you look closely, then you'll understand these things. If you look closely, then you'll understand that these ayat are not to belittle the Sahaba, but rather to raise their rank. Right? And that this entire situation was created by Allah Azza wa Jal to show this is how you solve a marriage. This is how you solve. You keep Allah Azza wa Jal in the middle. In this marriage, Allah Azza wa Jal came in the middle. In our marriages, Allah Azza wa Jal may not directly come and send ayat. But taqwa is supposed to be there, no? What is taqwa? That you worship Allah Azza wa Jal as if you can see Him. And if you do not see Him, remember He sees you. Right? So, paying attention to Allah Azza wa Jal is not only when you're in salah. You know, we generally in salah, we're like, I need to pay attention, I need to focus on Allah. You're supposed to focus on Allah at every moment, outside of that as well. How are you focusing on Allah in your marriage? That what you're saying can be counted against you or in your favor. So, this kind of summarizes some of these ayat which talk about this. Then the next ayah, Allah Azza wa Jal says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu qu anfusakum wa ahlikum nara, and we'll stop here. But the ayah basically speaks about, O you who believe, save yourselves and your family from a fire. Right? Meaning, when you solve conflict in your marriage, when you solve conflict between yourself and your children, when you have problems, when you have issues in your relationships with other people as well, not just in your marriage or your family, but in other people as well, do it with the intention knowing that you are protecting yourself from the fire. Right? So when you desist, stay away from harming people and devote yourself to benefiting people, remember that you're doing this so that Allah Azza wa Jal can reward you and protect you from the harm of the hereafter. Right? And the utmost and ultimate goal of relationships, and in specifically marriage, because marriage is the closest and strongest, and family, etc. The most greatest and important goal of a family, of a marriage, is for you to protect yourself from the fire, nothing else. If you can obtain that goal, everything you've done is successful. If you fail, if I fail, if we fail to obtain that goal, then it doesn't really matter how much you put effort into other things. This is why this ayah is coming after Allah Azza wa Jalla is speaking about marriage and Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and his wives. Meaning, everything you do, remember it's to protect yourself from the fire. Remember, everything you do has consequences. Nothing you do that you'll get away with. And may Allah Azza wa Jalla protect us, but hisab is something very scary in the hereafter. Right? People will see things that they never remembered, and that they did, and that they said. All of that will be brought before a person. This is why, in the context of marriage, now Allah Azza wa Jal is speaking about the hereafter. Remember the hereafter. Think about the hereafter. Think about Jahannam. Think about Jahannam in your marriage. Think about Jahannam in your family. Think about how do you protect yourself from that fire. And the ayah even elaborates what is that fire. And we'll continue on that next week. But Allah Azza wa Jal explains what is this fire. Why should you think about it? Why does Allah Azza wa Jal elaborate on what the fire is? May Allah Azza wa Jal grant us understanding of these ayat and forgive us for any shortcoming in our attempt to understand His perfect word. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Sadaqallahu al-azim. Subhanallah bihamdihi subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Just a reminder.